Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Or maybe I should say good night, because I am in Paris right now and it is midnight for me. My name is Suleiman Bashir Diagne. I'm a professor in the departments of French and philosophy. And I'm the director of the Institute of African Studies. And it is my pleasure and my honor, really, to chair this celebration of a great book by Camille Robcis, Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France. Camille is a professor of history and French at Columbia University, so we are colleagues in the Department of French. She specializes in modern European intellectual history with a focus on 19th and 20th century France. Camille Robcis is the author of The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the Family in France. Let me just add to this that this book was really absolutely influential in France, especially during the time of protests and for equality in marriage. She's currently working on a new project after this one, tentatively titled The Gender Question, Populism, National Reproduction, and the Crisis of Representation. Let me just say that Disalienation is the story of institutional psychotherapy, beautifully told here, from its birth in Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole after World War II. It is also the story of its developments, in particular in the thought and the works of prominent figures such as Gilles Deleuze or Guattari or Frantz Fanon. And it is also an invitation, and that is the end of the book. The book ends on an invitation to think with institutional psychotherapy. And who could better do that, think with institutional psychotherapy and have a conversation with Camille on this wonderful book of her, than the three scholars that are going to participate in this conversation and in this celebration of the work. So we have speakers. The speakers are Laure Miura. Laure is the director of the Center for European and Russian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. And she's also a professor in the Department of French and Francophone Studies. She is the author of several books, including La Maison du Docteur Blanche, Passage de l'Odéon, La Loi du Genre, and Quand l'homme qui se prenait pour Napoléon, et L'homme qui se prenait pour Napoléon, translated into English as The Man Who Thought He Was Napoleon. After Laure Mura's presentation, following that of Camille, Katherine Tabb will be our next speaker. Katherine is our own colleague at Bard University. She's assistant professor of philosophy at Bard College. Her interests include philosophy of science and medicine, bioethics, psychopathology, American pragmatism, and the history of philosophy, especially early modern philosophy. Katherine Tabb is currently working on a monograph on John Locke, Agents and Patients, Locke's Ethics of Thinking. So we have many more books to celebrate in the near future. Last, and certainly not least, will be Thomas Dortmund. Thomas is Camille and myself, our colleague in the Department of French, where he is assistant professor of French at Columbia University. His first book, What Nostalgia Was, War, Empire, and the Time of Deadly Emotion, explores how people once died of nostalgia in order to tell a larger story about social transformation and alienation in the 18th and 19th century. And Thomas also co-edits the French journal Sensibilité, Histoire, Critique et Sciences Sociales, and he serves on the editorial board of Critical Historical Studies. So here are the three prominent colleagues who are going to celebrate Camille's book by having a conversation with her on disalienation. So first, Camille is going to speak, to present her book for 10 minutes, after which Laure Miura is going to respond, to discuss for 8 minutes, followed by Katherine, same time, and Thomas, also 8 minutes. And then Camille will speak again to respond to the discussants for 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how the questions and the comments came. And after that, you are invited from the audience to use the Q&A box that you have on the bottom, the right bottom of your screen, and send my way your questions and comments that I will relay then to Camille and the discussants as well. So without further ado, please let's welcome Camille Robcis and her presentation of Disalienation.
Thank you so much, Bashir. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Did you guys see it? It works? Yeah, okay, good. So first of all, thank you so much to the Heyman Center and to the Maison Française, to the divisional deans in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and to my two departments, History and French, for sponsoring this event. I'm also really immensely grateful to Bashir, to Laure, Katie, and Thomas for agreeing to participate in this event. I really am a huge admirer of all their work, and it's an honor to have them read my book and spend the next hour basically listening to their thoughts for me. So thank you to all of you. So this book, I'm going to try to be brief. It's hard because when you just finish a book, you have a lot to say. But it's in general terms, it's a conversation. I try to map the conversation between radical psychiatry, politics, and philosophy in France throughout the second half of the 20th century. More specifically, I'm going to try, it focuses on this movement called institutional psychotherapy that Bashir mentioned, and I wanted to sort of spend a few minutes telling you about this concept. Where did it emerge? Who were the main actors? What was the central theoretical intervention? And end with this sort of considerations on what is the legacy, or what was the legacy of institutional psychotherapy, and what we can do with this today. So first of all, where did it emerge? Bashir already mentioned the small town in central France called Saint-Alban. It was born during the Second World War, so in the psychiatric hospital. And the context of the war was really essential in bringing together the cast of characters who first practiced institutional psychotherapy and laid out its theoretical foundations. But the war and the experience of fascism was also crucial to convince the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy that psychiatry was and needed to be fundamentally political. So by now it's well documented that the Third Reich openly embraced eugenics and the forced euthanasia of those that it deemed the incurable sick. What came to be known as Action T4 was central to the Nazi program of racial purification, and it resulted in around 300,000 deaths. But what is less well known is what was happening in French psychiatric clinics during those years. And so the Vichy regime was letting patients die of cold, of hunger, or lack of care, what some historians like these two, have called the soft extermination of around 40,000 patients in France. The doctors, the nurses, and the staff that worked at Saint-Alban were all painfully aware of this reality. And so their first goal was very literally to sort of hoard enough food and help patients survive the war. But along the way, they were joined by poets, visual artists, philosophers, and political activists who shared their interest in madness and who also shared this vision of psychiatry as a deeply political practice. So who were some of the main characters? I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this character because he plays a very important role in the book. François Tosquelles, who was a Catalan psychiatrist who fought in the Spanish Civil War and fled to France after Franco's victory. While Tosquelles was training to become a psychiatrist in Barcelona during the interwar years, he became also very involved in the vibrant labor/anarchist movement that was kind of booming during those years in Catalonia, especially a group called the PUM, which was a resolutely anti-Stalinist organization that preached decentralization, federalism, self-management, and constant critique. Tosquelles was also one of the early readers, early and enthusiastic readers of Jacques Lacan. This is important for the kind of theory that will come out of institutional psychotherapy. And it wasn't so much the psychoanalyst Lacan that we mostly know today, but the more medical Lacan. Especially Lacan's 1932 thesis, which is this one on paranoia, which we can almost read as a kind of manifesto for the psychiatric field. Not only did Lacan argue that psychoanalytic concepts could be helpful to psychiatry, and this was at a time in which psychiatry was very much dominated by an organicist and neurological approach to mental illness. So already saying that psychoanalysis was helpful was pretty revolutionary. But more provocatively, Lacan argued that psychiatry needed to be anchored in a Freudian understanding of the subject, a subject that was constructed around conscious and unconscious representations of others, of other people. So what this meant was that the social around you was absolutely central to make sense of the individual psyche. After the defeat of the Republican troops, Tosquelles fled to France and was placed in a concentration camp for Spanish refugees, where he decided to set up a psychiatric service to help with the various psychological illnesses that were emerging from the trauma of the war and the deplorable conditions of camp lives. So you see Tosquelles here. What's interesting about his experience in the camp is that there was no other really medical staff, so he recruited political activists, artists, musicians to help him organize these activities like the concerts, theater productions, publications, group therapies, all of which to try to deal with what he called camp psychosis. And this is a quote from him during this time. He says, "There was only one psychiatric nurse, the rest were normal people. I think this is one of the places where I conducted very good psychiatry, in the concentration camp in the mud." This experience of concentrationism, of living in the concentration camp, convinced Tosquelles of two things. First of all, that you could practice psychiatry anywhere. And secondly, that in order to treat a patient, you needed to also treat his or her social environment. So you needed to cure the camp, the hospital, the institution at the same time as you cured the patient. And these were some of the principles that guided institutional psychotherapy at Saint-Alban. So what was the main theoretical intervention? I realized when I wrote this, we have to think of institutional psychotherapy as both practice and theory. So it's not like the theory came before, the theory comes out of the practice, but it's intimately tied to the practice and the theory intimately tied together. But one way I think that to summarize or to best summarize what these doctors were trying to achieve is this quote by Jean Hoarding, where he says, "Institutional psychotherapy was the act of setting up all kinds of mechanisms to fight every day against that which can turn the whole collective towards a concentrationist or segregationist structure." So what does this mean? Let me try to unpack this. Well, according to Tosquelles and his colleagues, some of them pictured here, institutions, so things like families, parties, unions, hospitals, schools, all these institutions were necessary for social and psychic organization. So the problem with institutions is not that they existed, and it's not so much that they generated conflict, because of course they did. The problem is that they all had this potential to become concentrationist or segregationist, right, to use Hoarding's term, authoritarian, hierarchical, stagnant, oppressive. This had become especially clear to Tosquelles after the war, at the PUM, in the front, and in the camp. Stalinism for him was a great example of leftist politics having become concentrationist, anti-democratic. The camp didn't have to be this horrifying environment, and yet it was. Same thing with the hospital. You don't need to tie patients to their beds and treat them like animals, and yet this is what was happening. So how could we prevent this? How could you disalienate institutions? And here, alienation, I think it's helpful if you understand it in its French term alienation, which means both a kind of the psychic state of being mad or insane, but also alienation is a social condition of feeling estranged, trapped, or isolated from others. In other words, could psychiatry imagine, within the limited confines of the hospital, a philosophy, a social theory, and a clinical practice that could prevent the reappearance of these political and psychic concentrationisms, institutions that could be constantly rethought, reworked, and remapped? To disalienate the patients, the hospital, and the psychiatric profession, but also the community at large, you needed to begin at the level of architecture. And this is kind of abstract, but let me give you some examples of what they did, again, very kind of practically speaking. So the first thing they did is to get rid of the walls that separated the asylum from the village, because again, to kind of forget the enclosure. So these were the walls that were eventually tumbled. They also got rid of the divisions that separated each cells. This is an example of the kind of dormitories where everybody slept together. Similarly, you eliminated uniforms and medical blouses so that you could no longer tell who was a nurse, a patient, or a doctor. And this had a kind of theoretical purpose, but also practical purpose to explode fixed roles. To not get you too used to being in a particular position of power or of subservience. If the hospital was to serve as a healing collective, then it also needed to develop structures to produce or to institute this new social. One of the most important innovations was the club, which was a kind of a patient-run cooperative that was in charge of organizing all the activities of the hospital. The meals, the theater performances, the musical performances, sports, parties, field trips, all social activities that were deemed integral to the cure. So these are some examples of the kinds of performances that they would do at Saint-Alban. You see some jazz performances, theater, but there's many of these and kind of excellent visual documentation of this, two movies where you see the patients really going on vacation together. The club also ran the library and the different ergotherapy sessions. So you could see like this painting, but there was pottery, woodworking. And I should say in parenthesis too, that this is some of the art that came out of the hospital ended up making its way to museums under the label of art brut or outsider art. So this was one example of a patient who was at Saint-Alban, Auguste Forestier. You can see Tosquelles is carrying his boat here, whose work is now at the Collection de l'Art Brut in Switzerland, in Lausanne. And the person who was responsible for bringing it there was Jean Dubuffet, who was very interested in kind of playing with this idea of art and madness. So the club also ran a series of journals. This is one called Trait d'Union, which was, you can see here an editorial by Tosquelles and another one by Fanon here. And it was a mix of texts, drawings, recipes, advertisement letters, and it had, again, a practical and a theoretical goal. It was philosophically stimulating, but it would also get you out of your head into the social environment. Finally, one last example, because this is one of my favorites. It's the grid from Laborde, which is another clinic where they practiced institutional psychotherapy. So you can see it's a double entry chart with the names of the staff members and the work that was assigned to him or her each day, and you would rotate these roles. So the idea was, again, that you wouldn't get too used to doing, nursing or food or laundry, and that you were constantly destabilized. To use the terms of Guattari, the grid was an instrument of disorganization to avoid the passivity generated by the bureaucratic routine. So finally, what is the legacy of institutional psychotherapy? From the beginning, institutional psychotherapy had many followers. And so each of my chapters of my book is centered on one of these people. I'll just mention very briefly Fanon, who was a medical resident at Saint-Alban after he completed medical school in Lyon. And when he arrived to Saint-Alban, Fanon had already written two important books, well, Black Skin, White Mask, and the important essay, The North African Syndrome. And the kinds of experiments that Tosquelles and his colleagues had set up at Saint-Alban and the results they were getting confirmed many of the philosophical hypotheses that Fanon had put forth in his earlier work on race and racism. So Fanon brought institutional psychotherapy to North Africa. You see him here in Algeria with his staff, but it's also there that he wrote some of his most well-known and political works, including The Wretched of the Earth, when he got more involved with anti-colonial activism. So you could say that institutional psychotherapy was literally intertwined from a theoretical standpoint, but also at the very concrete level of production with Fanon's political works. He would see patients, he would write his texts in the morning, dictate them to his assistant, and then in the afternoon see patients. So the two really went hand in hand. Another example of an early advocate of institutional psychotherapy was Jean Houry, who was a resident at Saint-Alban and then opened the clinic of Laborde in the 50s. Throughout the 1960s, Laborde became a sort of mythical pilgrimage site for the French intellectual world, as it welcomed philosophers, artists, writers, and filmmakers, in addition to the medical personnel. Laborde also famously provided a home for the philosopher, psychoanalyst, and political activist Félix Guattari, for whom the type of psychiatry that was being performed at Laborde was in perfect continuity with his political and philosophical activities. All of these provided different terrains to think through the role of institutions as social and subjective anchors, but also to envision radically horizontal, anti-authoritarian, and deterritorialized spaces, to use this term. And this is especially evident in his 1972 book that he co-wrote with Gilles Deleuze, Anti-Oedipus. As Michel Foucault put it, Anti-Oedipus was primarily a book of ethics. Its goal was to convince its readers to give up their attachments to authority, to oppression in their practices of everyday life, to renounce what Foucault called the fascisms in our head, which is another way to talk about alienation, right? The kind of, or the word they used was Oedipalization, but everything that traps your desire, that makes you be attached to these authoritarian mechanisms. So finally, just in conclusion, what do we make of all this? I have a lot to say here, but I know I'm going way over time, so I'll just say two things. I think institutional psychotherapy can help us think about politics broadly, not just to understand fascism in its historical manifestation, so the Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, the fascism that, as I have argued in the book, was crucial for the development of institutional psychotherapy. But it can also help us understand why these fascisms in our heads persist, right? So not just the kind of overt politics, but why it is that unconsciously we're attached to certain things. I wrote much of this during the Trump years, so of course, this was something that was kind of very present with me, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. But I think some of the main concepts that institutional psychotherapy puts forth, like the unconscious, alienation, fantasy, desire, identification, transference, are all still very helpful to think about politics. And secondly, one of the main lessons of institutional psychotherapy was that you needed to reorganize the hospital to disalienate alienation, but this was never a kind of once and for all project. Like you never got to a point where you're like, now I'm disalienated, right? To produce a collective was to produce the conditions of possibility of this collective, to work through the effects of transference, of counter-transference, resistances, and power with constant vigilance. Houry uses this term that I really like in French, which says ne pas laisser en passer une, to not let one go, to never give up, right? Because every time you do, alienation creeps back up. So, and in this process, the unconscious is essential as the vector through which individuals and collectives can explore these fantasies, conflicts, and desires, the means for the group to avoid closing itself on itself. So I think the theory behind institutional psychotherapy, but also these very practical experiments that I describe in the book, can provide us a set of practical tools, some successful and some less so, to erode hierarchy, domination, and forms of authoritarianism in group life, and to ultimately envision different political imaginaries. And so the book concludes with this kind of conversation around the common, and some of these recent books and political movements that have tried to also think about what it means to kind of speak in these group formations, and to think of institutions as necessary and yet provisional at the same time. So I'll stop right here. Thank you so much, and I'll let the floor to Laure, I think.
Thank you, Camille. And please, Laure, go ahead for 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me say that first, I'm very happy to be here with you, at least remotely, and very honored to be part of this panel. When I met Camille a few years ago, she was already working on Disalienation, which is a beautiful title, by the way. And I remember thinking very selfishly, finally, I feel less lonely. People who are interested in institutional psychotherapy are very few in France, no wonder in the US. Usually people don't even know what is institutional psychotherapy. This is to say, first, and to put it simply, that disalienation is filling a huge and important gap. If only for this, I'm very grateful to Camille. I brought her like a virtual present, which is the photo Jean Houry gave me, which represent the schizophrenia, which is quite interesting regarding, Camille asked me this photo for her book cover, and unfortunately I was not in LA, so I couldn't give it to her. But here it is. I don't know if you see, it's basically a tree uprooted, which means that schizophrenia is the same, some kind of total disconnection in the mind. So that was my virtual present to Camille and to honor her beautiful book. Now the book. So anyone who read it will say the same as me. The research, the intellectual rigor, and its carefulness to make us understand philosophical systems in their political context are remarkable. It makes the book interesting to read and to reflect upon all the way through. Since we are very limited in time, I'm going to go straight to the point by addressing a short set of questions to Camille. The first one is about the exact topic of the book. The title, Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, indicates very clearly what the book is about. Although one could rephrase it, what was the impact of institutional psychotherapy to intellectual history in post-war France, which is not exactly the same. The word missing in the title is replaced by radical psychiatry for excellent reasons. Even in French, institutional psychotherapy doesn't ring a bell to anyone and always triggers questions like what it is, I don't understand, what do you mean by institutional psychotherapy? Even the founding fathers were embarrassed to justify such a bizarre, expression. But on the back cover, the content of the book is presented otherwise. The author, I quote, traces the history of institutional psychotherapy from its origins through its various transformations between 1945 and 1975. It is about this slight discrepancy, or rather about what I read as a slight discrepancy, that I would like to elaborate on. Disalienation certainly traces, and very carefully so, the origins of institutional psychotherapy in the first chapter dedicated to this beautiful character who is François Tosquelles, and the realization that psychiatric asylum is organized as a concentration camp. It happens that I recently met with Annette Wiewiórka, who is a great historian of the Holocaust, and she was telling me that her uncle survived Auschwitz. And this uncle became a great pediatrist, not a psychiatrist, a pediatrist, and always said his experience in Auschwitz helped him understand how the hospital is structured, which is quite frightening. So the totalitarian logic at the core, not only of the asylum, but of the hospital, and one can think of the Derridian concept of hospitality that derives from hospital, is a major concept of the 20th century. And thanks to Camille, we really understand that. It will be followed historically what Camille is explaining, by a set of structural innovations detailed in the book that are truly revolutionary. A revolution that succeeds is paradoxically a failing revolution. One can say that institutional psychotherapy never succeeds and therefore kept intact its revolutionary potential. How come institutional psychotherapy never implements? In other words, how come, and I'm aware of how naive is this question, changing life remains impossible. My second question is linked to the first, but I'm aware that's my personal obsession also. My second question is linked to the first. It seems to me that the great absentee of the book is the patient. Camille stressed all along, and rightly so, that theory and practice are and must be linked, but the practice, at least the psychiatric one, never shows, at least in its effects. I will give just one example, just to demonstrate that it's linked to the intellectual context. It is a story, I cannot say an anecdote, and you will understand why, that Jean Houry told me, and Camille, probably he told you the same, because he was, at the end of his life, he was repeating everything to, the same to anyone. So in May 68, there was a great effervescence that you're tracing very carefully in the Guattari chapter, especially about desire and the famous Machine Désirante, which is the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, away from Lacanian and psychoanalytical familialism. Masturbez-vous, masturbate, were claiming leftists at La Borde at that time, while Jean Houry was quite, let's say, reluctant to such a program. The day after, he told me, the day after this, big party where everyone was saying masturbez-vous, masturbate, the day after, told me Jean Houry, I discovered that one of my patients who masturbated in public hung himself in his bedroom. What I want to say, a little bit bluntly, because we don't have time to develop that, but ideas have effects, right? Ideology is certainly not therapy, even though theory is already a practice. So how Frantz Fanon, for instance, revolutionary concepts inspired by institutional psychotherapy, resonated in Bleeder's hospital and implemented changes in the decolonization of the mind. How Foucault could have switched his mind so quickly, although we know that Foucault switched his mind quite quickly, in many instances, about institutional psychotherapy, what it was totally aligned with his first studies. So again, I'm fully aware that answering these questions would have supposed making a much more conventional history of institutional psychotherapy, which is not the purpose of the book, with developments about less known people like Georges Daumaison, Lucien Bonafé, Jean M, but also Gisela Pankov, Hélène Chéniaud, or Ginette Michaud. You're saying, Camille, that institutional psychotherapy was a very white male group, which is totally true. Nevertheless, a few women, I don't say anything about other people, but a few women were quite important. In other words, my last question would be, why skipping the part between the origins of institutional psychotherapy, which is chapter 1, and its transformations through what you call, rightly so, fellow travelers, and jump straight forward to the ones who deterritorialized the theory, which is chapter 2, 3, and 4, the 3 other chapters, although your pages on the first Michel Foucault are very illuminating, I'm having a hard time to include him in that category. Was he really a fellow traveler? I'm not sure about that. Instead of focusing first on how the concepts developed or don't develop. These are questions from a historian to another historian on the choice you're making and the structure you want to highlight. It doesn't change anything about the value of Camille's book, which is a model of intellectual history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for starting this conversation. And now, Katherine Tabb, I invite you to comment.
Thank you,
for
Michel.
8 minutes.
All right. I couldn't agree more with Lau that spending time with Camille's book has led to manifold pleasures. I'm also very tempted to enumerate them, but after my repeated reminder of 8 minutes, I'm going to move right ahead and do what I think Camille is asking her reader to do, which is to think with her and apply what she's given us to the context that we see to be most urgently in need of these ideas, what Laura just referred to as our personal obsessions. So I want to begin, therefore, by specifying what kind of reader I am. I think many of us will appreciate this book in manifold different ways. I'm a philosopher of psychiatry, but I'm not trained in the tradition that Camille traces. I'm not trained in continental theory. I was brought up in a very different analytic tradition of philosophy of science. So one thing that struck me really powerfully reading Disalienation is that Camille has given someone like me, who's looking for theoretical tools with which to deconstruct contemporary psychiatry's increasingly unstable structures, something really new. Something old has become something new, reaching across traditions that we usually keep distinct. I just think it's amazing. I want to focus on one aspect of the constellation of methods that constituted institutional psychotherapy, which can help bring into clear view what I see as a crisis for contemporary medicine, and especially for psychiatry. And this is institutional psychotherapy's holism, that is, its insistence on the gestalt over the mechanism, the diffusion of power over its concentration, the traversal over the localized. In my recent work, I've been focusing on a new paradigm in contemporary medicine called precision medicine. And precision medicine is the subject of massive public investment, also of massive local investment, like the one at Columbia. Columbia's medical school is funding their precision medicine initiatives to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Precision medicine, I want to suggest, justifies a set of methods on the grounds of a set of values. And these values should be familiar to us from another turn of the century initiative, which uses the same vocabulary, that of precision warfare. So the idea is that precision treatments use molecular signatures and other biomarkers to match a patient to treatment, such that an intervention can be targeted and minimize side effects. So like precision warfare, you get in, you get out, you have few casualties. The National Institute of Mental Health has engaged precision psychiatry enthusiastically, and much of its funding budget now goes towards a search for biomarkers and causal mechanisms that can act as appropriate targets. So what I want to suggest is that this is a return to the search for lesions that characterized psychiatry in its early days, though now no one's looking for an injury, but rather for a telltale pattern in neural circuitry or a certain genetic profile or a particular behavior of plaques and tangles. Variation is calibrated with powerful, and I think after reading Camille, we want to say Foucauldian exactitude. It can be very hard to argue with precision medicine. Everyone wants their particular pathology to be seen, and it's featured a lot of direct-to-consumer advertising that encourages us to think it will save us, so that we're more likely to give up our personal data. Precision medicine requires data sets of just unprecedented scope, orders of magnitude over what's been needed before. And these direct-to-consumer adverts can also appeal to our sense of duty. So Columbia, for example, participates in a recruitment effort that's called All of Us, as if precision medicine will translate smoothly into public health. I think it won't. And this brings me to my point, which is that I think the history Camille tells us gives us a new vocabulary for saying why that I think has been really absent from this conversation. So I'm really excited to find it. As her protagonist put it, quote, "Madness was never a personal affair." The obsession with localization may lead to good science, but this was pointedly not the concern of the institutional psychotherapists. They believed in medicine, but they were skeptical of medical ethics. Their worry had to do with medicine's obligation, not just to the individual, but as Camille puts it, to human life itself. Medicine was ethical for Camille's authors when it assured through active work, ongoing work, that its institutions did not take on the forms of the camps. Now, as precision psychiatry spins off into these headier realms of the new brain sciences, and I should say other words for precision psychiatry, other names for it have been applied neuroscience or clinical neuroscience. I think that the reminder that Camille's book offers is really, really crucial. Another beautiful quote: "Psychological and psychopathological speculation must have practical truth as its goal." 21st century medicine, I think, has little interest or concern about the states of its institutions. It is increasingly focused on the output of its labs. I think this is an ethical crisis that we really lack language for. But I want to note that Camille has asked us to be very, very careful about the use of fascism as a metaphor. So I want to make clear that I hear her on that, and I'm not ready to adopt the institutionalist psychotherapist framework to accuse precision medicine, or I should say Columbia University, of concentrationism. But I think for the American clinician or for the philosopher of medicine, this framework is really valuable, in large part because Western radical psychiatry seemed to really pass America by. And that's something I'd really like to hear more from Camille about what she sees as the legacy of this tradition in the States. Like so many American phenomena, during the period Camille discusses, this is my perspective on it, resistance to biopsychiatry was taking more extreme forms. This kind of enthusiastic and eccentric styles of what she refers to as schizo-fashion. So on the one hand, you had the anarchic positivity of R.D. Laing. On the other hand, you had the grim libertarianism of Thomas Szasz. And a vision of the psychiatric institution as a source of communitarian power was, I think, really lacking and is still lacking. So in that sense, I think the book has not come too late. I think that the current pandemic, with its very blunt ways of killing, its exhaustion of our resources, its exhaustion of us, has brought questions up about precision medicine that are overdue for review. We don't tend to think much about how our tax dollars earmarked for medical research and clinical care are used, but I would agree with Camille's protagonist that I think these questions are really at the heart of our politics, or should be at the heart of our politics. We should ask questions like, what happens to people who are sick, but about whom nothing precise can be said? What happens to those pathologies that are run of the mill, the typical effects of traumas from systemic racism, from wage labor, environmental crises, or the politics of austerity? As Camille writes, quote, "One of the main tenets of institutional psychotherapy was that alienation constituted one of the fundamental dimensions of human existence, whether one was considered normal or crazy." For the figures she writes about, medicine was the fulcrum for revolution, because without health, people can't make other worlds, and no one is healthy when they desire their own oppression. Capitalism has recently made precision medicine possible, and capitalism has made a feverish market also for the consumption of precision medicine. Disalienation, I think after reading this book, requires not precision medicine, it requires general medicine. General medicine can happen in the rural clinic, it can happen in the urban collective, it doesn't need much. I think about Cuba's medical school, which trains its doctors to go do their job with only the equipment that they can hike in with. And I think that general medicine need not shrink from technological advance, but I think that idea of looking for the kind of medical care that can be done anywhere that Camille describes is so important. What I think binds general medicine to the motivations of Camille's protagonists is that it looks first for structural explanations. The microplastics in the water, the forest smoke in the air, it goes from there, and it's a human science. I think it's possible that the need for transversal community care for medical commons seemed more true in the last century than it does now, but I find it hard to believe because it seems So very crucial now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. So Thomas, you go now.
Yep, great. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bashir. Thank you to Katie. Thank you, Laure. Thank you, everyone. And especially thank you, Camille, for bringing us together. I'm delighted to be talking about this book. I can remember very well the phone conversation we had about Disalienation, or what was not yet Disalienation, 5, maybe 6 years ago. And about what kind of publisher would be best for it. I don't think we didn't know each other that well back then, and I don't think we knew we were going to be colleagues. But I think that if that's the case, I'm pretty sure that I hoped we would soon become colleagues. So I feel as if this book has really sort of marked our professional, intellectual exchanges, and most of all, our friendship. I'm going to say a few words about the individual chapters, and then try to draw some of the conceptual and methodological constellations that they give rise to. Mine are less questions than invitations to think along with or perhaps against. Each of these chapters, I think, provides unexpected and incredibly rich portraits of individuals and texts, both familiar and lesser known. I came out of them reading them feeling that I understood a lot more about the main and secondary characters, and wanted you to write book-length intellectual biographies of each one of them. As simple as that, just a lot of books. I really developed an appreciation and even a certain affection, I think, for François Tosquelles, whose wartime commitments and peacetime accomplishments, not to mention his mad professor looks and art brut performance acrobatics, and I'm thinking of that wonderful photo of him on page 45 that you showed earlier, strike me as a life worth living, or as you say, using the Foucauldian metaphor, an ethics. It is in Tosquelles' trajectory, I think, that we really see the imbrication of theory and practice that Disalienation argues was so central to institutional psychotherapy. I also gained a much better understanding of the relation between theory and practice in Fanon the psychiatrist, and Fanon the militant, which is the same, and of Fanon's place within a decentered Francophone theory, which made me feel a bit better about the waning of French theory. I think I now get what Fanon meant by national culture. Still not 100% sure, but I think I do. And I certainly think this chapter successfully exploits the handy double meaning of alienation in French, to which you alluded before, to lay the groundworks for what could be a kind of politics and psyche in a deterritorialized fin d'Empire France. And I'm nodding, of course, to Karl Schosky's famous book. I have a long list of questions about Lacan and Guattari and Deleuze, and maybe we should start saying them in that order, starting with some very minor material ones. A deterritorialized, anti-institutional institution and anti-Oedipian psychotherapy set up in a castle? Seriously? A schizotic disegoization premised on a double entry bookkeeping timetable grid, something that I associate to the rise of capitalism and perhaps a Protestant ethic? I mean, I know these are French theorists, not German ones, and irony is an art de vivre, but at the very least, I hope this provides us with the opportunity to do what we've often talked about before, which is to explore the connection and the divergences in fighting the fascisms in our heads with Marx and Freud on either side of the Rhine in the mid-20th century, which is all a way of saying that I finally am going to read Anti-Oedipus seriously so that we can teach a class on it and authoritarian personality together. Last but not least, Foucault, ever the half a step, but maybe not, outlier, whose 1969 ponderings about what is an author and how an author might in fact be a function of a discourse suddenly made a lot more sense to me in the light of the conceptual and editorial vicissitudes of his early works on mental illness and their anti-psychiatric recuperation, a case of Barthes' death of an author, if there ever was one. I came out of it thinking that Foucault was at least partially complicit. I think this goes back to something that Laure was saying, partially complicit in his own discursive afterlives, and feeling no less ambivalent than I have often felt about his ultimate flight into power, which for all its microphysics remains a power with no name and at least a dash of metaphysics. But what I really want to talk about is this extraordinary 1954 picture of Foucault in Münsterlingen, which is on page 114 in the book. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I feel I must share this. I'm just very quickly going to do it. Can you see? This is the photo. Can everybody see it? So this photo here in Münsterlingen, overlooked by Vermeer's enigmatic girl with a pearl earring, whose nonchalant, up here, nonchalant and yet quite interpolating sideways glance sheds a stern gaze over the young Michel and his very Euro-boyish mid-century intellectual pals, and whose pearl earring and oriental turban might remind us, together with Timothy Brooke and now Disalienation, that this is also the end of an empire, and that Fanon is surely lurking somewhere there in the background. I'm going to stop sharing that for a second. And I have to say, this picture also allows me to note on a much more prosaic note that I have never seen a picture of Foucault with hair, and that seeing one makes me feel a lot better about my receding hairline. But to put aside my petty neuroses and switch to the much more important psychoses that bind these characters and texts into the constellations of Disalienation. This is, from the beginning to end, a very Lacaprian book, obviously, fittingly. But I think it does something quite original in manipulating dialogically and transferentially the relation between texts and contexts, multiple contexts. I was struck by the way in which you piece together the many backdrops against which institutional psychotherapy emerges, and how you tease out many of the new foregrounds, new sort of foregrounded contexts and possibilities that it brings into being. So in a way, the dialogism and the transference is sort of tridimensional, I almost came to think of it. It's both synchronic and diachronic at once. The first I would say absolutely critical context is that of war. Both the extreme alienation and the psychosis produced by the experience of war, and the extraordinarily fertile terrain that war provided for experimenting in psychiatric treatments. For since the 19th century, armies had a similar dilemma, actually, as Tosquelles and co had at Saint-Alban and Laborde, a paradox that is at the heart of the book's object of study: how to harness institutions to formulate an anti-institutional kind of therapy, or what we might think of as writing a kind of negative discipline and punish. Many of the horizontal measures adopted, the collective forms of living and the ergotherapeutic activities, are actually quite strikingly similar to ones already instituted in European armies in the late 19th century, albeit, of course, within a setting that necessarily remained more hierarchical, more vertical, but which I think does raise the question of the possible efficacy of institutional psychotherapy in terms of the deconcentrationist, defascisticizing goals that it sets itself, and that Camille, you see as living on in discussions and political movements around the commons today. And I think it's a question that I think is that necessary, is that there always necessarily a kind of derive towards the fascistic tendencies that one would associate to the army. Another equally important context that stood out to me is that of the personal and interpersonal exchanges. And I'm thinking, for example, of Tosquelles and Balvez's unlikely friendship. I won't say much more about this, other than note how we always seem to minimize the more intimate, the affective, the personal, in parts in historical actors' lives, almost as if they didn't deserve the epistemological dignity that we accord to public persona and their intellectual output. But as Foucault's frustration at the muted reception of his early works among psychiatrists and the consequences this would have on his willingness to unmoor his texts and let them live an anti-psychiatric life of their own after 1968 suggest, we neglect who we are and the unconscious who we are not that lives with and between us at our own peril. And I think you do a wonderful job of showing that. Finally, I admire the way in which Disalienation zooms out, does a grand écart from the personal to the transnational, following the object of study in its unforeseen and rhizomatic meanders, to stretch the canvas and incorporate new contexts into old intellectual genealogies. What you do with Fanon in chapter 2 is really quite masterly. The textual exegesis of Fanon's writings, the intellectual biography of his brief encounter with Tosquelles at Saint-Alban, his appropriation and repurposing of institutional psychotherapy for a colonial context, and the struggle of decolonizing people's bodies and minds, and finally, reflexively, what Fanon's creative displacement does for our efforts to decenter and decolonize intellectual history and French theory. If the book's 4 chapters have a kind of A-B, A', B' structure, at least that's how I saw it, it is Fanon's fellow traveling sidestep rather than Foucault's that seems most convincing to me in terms of thinking institutional psychotherapy's subterranean influences and possibilities. At any rate, I mean, that might just be because I don't understand anti-editors, but anyway, at any rate, chapters 1 and 2 gave me the most joy and a little hope that yes, we can continue to think about and with these authors in class and elsewhere today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So Camille, you have you can take 5 minutes to respond to these comments and questions,
So
and
much,
then
yeah.
we will, and I remind the audience that the Q&A box is open for you to send in your questions that I would be very happy to read.
Thank you so much for all these wonderful responses. Yeah, I would have a lot more to say, but I'm only going to say very few things, and I hope we can continue this conversation at some point live. Maybe I'll say, I'm going to try to group some of these questions, and maybe I'll say three things. The first about the sort of the question of methodology and archives, which came out, I think, in the three talks. What is the exact topic of the book? That's a very good question. I mean, unlike my first book, where I think I had the argument and then I tried to find the archives to illustrate, that this was actually me becoming more of a historian along the way. Like, I really actually followed an archival trail, and it led me to these figures that were sort of surprising. So, for example, just to give one example, the chapter on Fanon. I didn't think I was going to include a chapter on Fanon originally, but I was sort of struck by the fact that he kept on that people. When I was talking to practitioners of institutional psychotherapy contemporary, they always they never mentioned Fanon. He was always kind of a back thought, right? And so I sort of started to think, what does this absence mean in this genealogy, right? Why is he constantly sort of put to the side, even though he seems to have had an important, he seems to have practiced institutional psychotherapy in France. So it certainly wasn't a history of institutional psychotherapy, but it was more an attempt to think about this particular, I mean, I use the term constellation in the book. So this particular idea of putting these characters together and seeing what happens when you zoom in and out, right? So what happens when you zoom in with some particular, if you focus on a particular thing, for example, the medical Lacan is one example, or the Foucault who's more interested in psychiatry rather than a critic. So we all know the critic of psychiatry that Foucault is, but I, for example, really didn't know the extent to which he was engaged with psychiatry so deeply until I did more of a kind of an archival research and read more of his early works, which are really hard to find, actually. I mean, Maladie mentale et personnalité, you can't even find it anymore. Foucault asked to never have it republished. So what do we make of those absences and those? So it was more. So in that way, it's a little bit, I don't know if it makes it more messy, but I sort of traveled with where the archives took me, and it is a book about institutional psychotherapy, but more importantly, I think it's a book about the relationships between the psyche and the political and like the kind of triangulation of philosophy, radical psychiatry, and psychiatry, radical philosophy, and politics, and thinking about how this particular articulation in the second half of the 20th century in France and in other contexts kind of happened. In terms of I think one thing about, one more thing about the question of the patients. That is something also I struggled with. It's partly a kind of a question of disposition. I didn't have access to any archives of the patients. Some of them were actually closed, so I didn't, but I also didn't look. I think it would have been perhaps a different book. I mean, we can talk about this further, but it didn't, I was really interested in kind of just following the trail of ideas, but it does, obviously, your question does pose a really important question, which again brings us back to Katie and to I think Thomas also. How is this? Was this effective? Was this not effective? It's helpful for me now to talk to clinicians, both mostly in the U.S. Actually, in France, I haven't really talked to them I've talked to a few people who still practice institutional psychotherapy, but I found a new generation of psychoanalysts and psychiatrists in the U.S. who have contacted me, who are really excited about these ideas and trying to use some of these techniques in community clinics and this and that, which I find fascinating. I have no sense of, I cannot at all assess if this works or doesn't work. The idea, for example, of the burst transference, that a psychotic patient can have a transference with a computer screen or the phone, like that means nothing to me. But I've talked to some clinicians who have explained to me that this is actually something helpful to them, when to try to deal with psychosis. But I think it does pose the question, I mean, one of the underlying questions and all is what is the result? I mean, you showed the picture of how do you cannot cure schizophrenia, right? So it's not like what is the point of all this at the end of the day? That if you take your uprooted tree, right, your choices are to either make it more rooted or more upright, right? To discipline it. I guess that would be the precision medicine, like giving a pill or taking curing the symptom or something. But that is not obviously. I think what they are calling for here is a radical rethinking of the notion of life, of what it means of normality and pathology, and a kind of reconsideration of illness, and ultimately a kind of the attempt that you could live a life that's less assisted, that's less handy, that's less where you can have a sort of freedom that's never going to be a full freedom. But I think this is where I think the success, I often get this question, did it work, did it not work? I don't know exactly what it would mean to work or not work. So anyway, but I think these are all really great questions and really important. And I think the last one more thing about the double keeping book and the castle also Thomas was asking about. I think it's also all of this is important because they believed in institutions, and this is one of the big differences with anti-psychiatry. I mean, Katie mentioned some of the big names of anti-psychiatry, and this was something that I'm sure that Jean-Henri also told you, like he was very upset if people confuse institutional psychotherapy and anti-psychiatry, right? Anti-psychiatry thought that the source of human unhappiness was institutions, so you needed to get rid of institutions, you needed to get rid of the family, you need to close down hospitals. They wanted institutions, so you need the timeline. The timeline is what gives you a sense of organization in your psychic space. The question is that the timeline shouldn't be an oppressive structure, or if it is, then let's talk about the feelings. I mean, that's like the endless meetings, group therapy meetings, right? I think there's something like 200 a month or something like that. So you could see this as horribly oppressive or liberating, if you think of something of a social coming out of these meetings. Anyway, but I have a lot more, but I think I should stop because we're running out of time, and I'm curious to see if to open up the conversation, or else to open it up to the audience.
Okay, and you have very interesting questions as well. Let me start with the first question, Aubrey, which is very straightforward. So as she says, asking what kind of illnesses were patients being treated for at Saint-Alban? Asking, is it schizophrenia? And did they have intellectual careers, many or most of them? And have some of them become psychiatric specialists themselves?
So yeah, maybe Lorcan actually has more to say about this, but I think it was mostly schizophrenia. I mean, it was a clinic for psychosis, but Laborde, at least when I visited there, it was a wide range of symptoms. It went from someone who was slightly depressed to someone who was pretty ill, pretty significantly schizophrenic. So it was, I mean, institutional psychotherapy was primarily a theory of dealing with psychosis. So it was about the specificity of psychosis, which is important and interesting because one of the problems with psychoanalysis is that, as Freud made clear, psychoanalysis did not work with psychotic patients in the same way that it was working with neurotic patients, because psychotics don't have the same relationship to the symbolic and to language. So you cannot have the talking cure with a psychotic patient who has a radically different understanding of language. So that's what I would say. But Laure, do you have any other thoughts on this, or?
Yes, all kinds. I mean, the question was for Saint-Alban, not for Laborde, but I mean, it's the same. And they welcome all patients, of course, schizophrenia, autism, paranoia. I mean, serious cases, usually, because there were patients that nobody wanted, basically. So it was just basically the psychiatric trash, right? That landed in Saint-Alban or Laborde. So of course, I mean, when I say trash, of course, it's ironic. So anyone with a very serious condition, and of course, psychosis, while, as you explained very well in your book, the whole purpose, the whole point of institutional psychotherapy was to bring psychoanalysis into psychotherapy and to say, because Jean-Houry was adamant about that, to say that, of course, there is a transference for psychotics. Of course, psychotic can have a transference with a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist.
Right.
So that was the key point, actually, of the cure. That's, you know, what we can say quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, you have a question from Joanna Stelnecker, who would like to hear more about the gender dynamics in institutional psychotherapy, both in theory and practice.
Yeah, so this is something also I struggled with because, you know, for all its deterritorialization and critiques of authority and hierarchy, it ultimately was a pretty male group and a pretty white group also, which is why, again, Fanon's exceptionality is something that I kind of pause on. I think it's interesting and important. So, you know, I have nothing else to say. I mean, some of the theorists that they read were obviously women. I mean, Laure, I think, mentioned Gisèle Lapankov. So there were, and there were other analysts who had an important role, especially at Laborde. But, you know, I mean, it's something I struggled with because at the end of the day, you know, you had these group meetings that were radically horizontal. Everybody could speak, but there is still the presence of the kind of the Jean-Houry, right? the genius luminary, and you know, yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. Basically, if anybody else wants to jump in.
Okay, well, if maybe you want to address the next question coming from Chris Power, which is about the Arboretum thought. Is the critique of Arboretum thought, as articulated in Anti-Oedipus and Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaux, addressed in the book? And he's thinking here of the actual cover that you have for your book, Disalienation, and the picture that Laure has just showed, the virtual gift she had for you. So, and the question raised by Chris is, why not, instead of a tree, have a potato for the image of the mind? If I can just interject something, because I see that the image you have on the cover of your book and the image shown by Laure, they have a family resemblance, obviously. And it made me think of this tree in the savannah, the baobab. I don't know if you have seen many baobabs. This tree is very special because it looks like its roots are up, and you expect that actually the actual branches and leaves are underneath. It is amazing how it is. So I was proposing that you look at the image of a baobab and ask if you could think of schizophrenia looking at that. But that's
amazing. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to look that up right now. Yeah, so I mean, the cover of the book is actually a painting by Giuseppe Pennone, who gave me this, and I'm super grateful because he's the great artist of trees. And when I thought, Laure and I had talked about this uprooted tree, and Jean-Houry often talks about schizophrenia that way, which makes sense, right? So the kind of idea of the free-floating signifiers, right? That's another way to talk about it, that they're not grounded into particular reference. So I really wanted an uprooted tree, and then Pennone gave me this tree. But I think the other connection here is the rhizome, as you say, in Anti-Oedipus and Mille Plateaux, but the kind of connections between different thinkers in the book, right? The way that something also Thomas brought up, the context. I mean, it is a very Lacaprian book. Lacapra was my advisor, and it's about it's about thinking about text and context and these personal friendships, which I think you make a very good point there, Thomas. Like, this is, they end up explaining a lot, and in the Foucault chapter, I think it's very clear, but in all the other chapters, right? Like how these particular interpersonal friendships end up actually determining a particular intellectual trajectory. I mean, on the Foucault, one more last thing about the Foucault, I went back and forth about whether to include him or not in this book. One of the things that, for example, was an indication to include him in the book was that he wrote, of course, the preface to Anti-Oedipus. And I asked someone recently about this, a Deleuze scholar, and he said, I think that was just personal friendship with Foucault, that it wasn't so much an endorsement of the theory, but that's interesting also that yet, even because Foucault would disagree with a lot of what Deleuze and Guattari say in Anti-Oedipus, and yet he still wrote that a very celebratory preface. So anyway, this is sort of what the tree made me think about. Thank you for those questions.
Okay. Let me now read the question coming from Lucie Mercier, who thanks you for your interesting interventions and has this to say: as you just highlighted it, one of the difficulties of thinking through institutional therapy, I think, is the tendency to be overly positive with these experiments, the actual contours and effects of which escape us retrospectively. And Laure mentioned it also. Fanon, for example, is always quite positive and optimistic about the effects of his treatments, or he doesn't comment much on them. But this was also a context of war, just as Tosquelles, where anything would be better than neglect or starvation. So it seems that there is some quite important difference there with experiments that happen in the Trente Glorieuses in a context that was not that of war. How do you think of this distinction within the different moments of your book?
Yes, so actually, the Fanon is a great example to talk about this because he actually was not always positive or optimistic about the effects of his treatments, and the chapter is mostly centered on a text he writes where he tries to implement institutional psychotherapy in Blida in Algeria, and it works really well for his white patients, the women patients, but it doesn't work at all with the Muslim men. And so the question for Fanon is to figure out, why this is not working. And he goes into this kind of revision of the theory, which is fascinating, where he basically realizes that he's doing a kind of imperialist psychiatry and applying the premises of that Tosquelles and the other doctors at Saint-Alban had taught him, that were supposed to be radically and decentered and all these things, but that still ended up being centered enough that they weren't working, practically speaking, with his Muslim patients' ward. And so it's a fascinating essay where he kind of goes back and tries to adapt the practices, like changes the movie selection, changes what they're doing, but also rethinks the theory alongside. So I think what's interesting to me is that it's not like, people ask you it's hard to say what is institutional psychotherapy because there's not a thing. I mean, it's a set of experiments, a practical experiments, a set of ideas, but there isn't a single definition that could be always used or applied. It's not a model or a grid that can be applied indiscriminately. That would really lose the kind of purpose of it, I think.
Okay. Normally, Bruno Bastille should be next, but Lucy has a follow-up quick question. Have you thought of organizing the book in another way, not based on individual biographies, but instead on concepts that traveled in a more rhizomatic way? Or was it always a project structured around portraits? And Thomas liked this approach precisely. Could you talk a little bit about the genesis of your project?
Yeah,
Can I add a word to that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in that suggestion there would potentially have made your book look a lot more like Steph Gerolanos's book on transparency, and because he's thinking also with nodes and how ideas and concepts sort of come together, and it struck me that there's a similarity there in terms of what you're trying to get at, but you're getting at it from very different angles.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think the book is somewhat rhizomatic in its conceptual framework because the ideas constantly refer back and forth, but it is true that ultimately they're kind of biographical, but not entirely. I mean, the Fanon chapter is more biographical, and the Foucault chapter, but say the first chapter on Saint-Alban talks about other doctors who were also very important. So I mentioned Tosquelles, but Laure mentioned other names, right? It's like de Maison, Bonafé, like all these are very, very important. And so I tried to not make it just focused on one person. But yeah, that's another, I mean, I think that's a great suggestion also to think about it more rhizomatically.
Okay, so I come back to the order of the questions now, Bruno's questions. The names of Freud and Marx were briefly mentioned. Could you say a bit more about the tensions and/or overlaps between institutional psychotherapy and another attempt to expand the study of the unconscious in the direction of politics, namely Freudo-Marxism, and perhaps even its uniquely French variety, Lacano-Althuserianism? You have 30 seconds for that.
Wow. So, I mean, I think one easy answer to this is that I think is that for the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy, there was no kind of revolutionary horizon in the sense that there's not a stage in which you would be disalienated, right? So alienation was constitutive of subjectivity. And I think this is where they differed with some of the Freudo-Marxists, who also really believed in the sort of, in the idea that the psyche and the social were mutually constitutive, right? Who believed that Freud and Marx were complementary figures to understand subjectivity, alienation. But there was always this kind of horizon of possible disalienation, of rationality, right? I mean, think of Adorno's attachment to something like rationality, right? So it's not like, you know, the thread is there, but there's still a kind of yearning for a horizon that I don't think institutional psychotherapy shares. I think the idea is that alienation is always going to sort of exist and come back. And the question is to find institutions that can accommodate, or that can sort of anesthetize these hierarchical or oppressive versions of alienation that will come up again and again. But the group is always destined to sort of have this potential.
Okay. This next question coming from Michael Herman I mean, it is really to you and the panel in general. Could you clarify the extent to which you are aware of present evidence of the clinical efficacy of these sorts of interventions?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, this is where I wish I would, like, none of my panelists here, fellow panelists, are practitioners. But I don't know if you guys want to say something. I mean, I think Katie's example of precision medicine was fascinating, also, and it might be linked to this idea of why it is that now I've been contacted by psychoanalysts and you know, I mean, not a ton. It's not like there's masses and masses of psychiatrists contacting me about this, but there's enough that I think that there's an interest out there to think about you know, medicine more holistically, and exactly what you were saying, Katie, that to try to think about you know, this is the problem with psychiatry and mental illness, is that as much as, and Laure's books are great on this too, right? As much as people have tried for centuries at this point to find an exact cause on the brain, or a particular thing you can, you know, particular organic manifestation or something, there just isn't, right? So that is the mystery in some ways of madness, or all psychic phenomena. And we all know this, right? There isn't, so the pill can make you feel better, but it's not going to have a kind of holistic approach to the social. And this is what I think there's a kind of important return to this, and certainly a yearning for this.
Yeah, I would just add that the challenge of finding empirical support for different psychotherapeutic methods is longstanding and really intractable. So part of the reason that we're seeing a massive turn to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right now in our country, as has happened in England and increasingly in Europe, is because it can show up. We can do randomized controlled trials and see its effects in a way we just can't for most species of psychotherapy. So something like this, we don't have a scientific means to assess it, and it's been hugely detrimental that we require that kind of justification for this kind of intervention, because it's so hard to produce.
Yeah.
Great. Let me now just read to you two final questions. Unfortunately, we will have to stop this great conversation. So one very short question, direct question. Do we have any PhDs being written on Tosquelles yet. And the other one, coming from Madeleine Dobby, could you say a little more about the relationship between Fanon's institutional practice in Blida and the case studies that you find in chapter 5 of The Wretch of the Earth?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll take Madeleine's question first. Yes, the case studies. I mean, I think what's interesting to me about Fanon, about the case studies, is it's obviously his most his most direct evidence of his psychotherapeutic actions, if you'd like, while he's in Blida. But what's interesting to me is that in some ways, what I tried to do in the book is to read the psychoanalytic and the psychiatric in places where it's not, where it doesn't seem like it's about this. So for example, in Fanon's discussion of national culture, I think he's very close to something like institutional psychotherapy. I mean, the way he so as I said, you know this, Madeleine, but he dictated his books to his assistant, who actually has written a book, so we know quite a lot about how Fanon would proceed. He did this from 7 to 9 a.m. and then he would see patients all day. So I think, even though I think it would be very hard to dissociate the political from the psychiatric, just at the level of everyday experience, right? You're doing the two at the same time. So I think there's a really interesting rereading of all of his political, especially The Wretched of the Earth, the chapters that seem less psychoanalytic. The chapter on violence, for example, that is so well known, I think of that really closely to the electroshock. The electroshock that Fanon practiced throughout his life. And part of what he liked about the electroshock was that it was this kind of burst of violence, and then you had this potential to reconstruct after, right? Like the electroshock. So it's interesting, again, because this is one of the things, again, talking about the efficacy, right? These are doctors at the end of the day who believed in medicine, who practiced all of things like electroshocks too, which is, again, something to think about. One last thought about the Tosquelles PhD. I don't think there are any Tosquelles PhDs theses out there, to my knowledge, but I think that would be a fantastic project. I will say, though, that there is an exciting exhibition happening right now in France about Tosquelles in Toulouse, and it's going to Barcelona and to Madrid, and we'll be coming to New York at the Museum of the AMFAR, the Museum of what's it called? I forget the full title, but it's going to be really exciting, and it's going to be about art brut and institutional psychotherapy and Tosquelles. So I think there might be, perhaps it'll be a less lonely space, Laure, for us interested in these questions.
Great. Well, on this optimistic view of an expanding
Tosquelles studies.
Yes. So I think we can stop here. I'm sorry we have to stop, and many questions were coming. So
thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Camille, for writing a wonderful book that has generated this conversation, and I'm sure it's going to generate many, many more conversations of the same kind. Very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everybody who participated, and thanks to all the audience members too. I'm very grateful.
Okay.